My husband said, "Wait in the car." He didn't ask. He never asked anymore. He said it the way he said everything to me those days, quickly, over his shoulder, already halfway out the door before the sentence had finished leaving his mouth. Like I was something to be managed. Like I was luggage he'd forgotten to check at the counter and was now, mildly apologetically, setting aside so it wouldn't slow him down. I was 51 years old. I had been married to Richard Hale for 26 of those years. And on a gray Tuesday morning in March, sitting in the passenger seat of a car I had paid the down payment on, I watched my husband walk into a bank without me, and I felt something inside my chest go very still. I want to tell you that I had a bad feeling right away. That some instinct rose up and warned me. But the truth is simpler and sadder than that. The truth is I had gotten so used to being told to wait that I almost didn't notice anymore. Almost. I looked down at my hands in my lap. My wedding ring caught the weak March light. 26 years. 2 children raised, both grown now, both gone from the house. A career I had paused for a few years that had somehow turned into a lifetime. A husband who used to open car doors for me and now couldn't be bothered to explain why we were at First Meridian Bank on a Tuesday morning instead of him simply handling it, as he always did, alone, at his convenience on his terms. I told myself I would wait 5 minutes. Then I would go in. I did not know, sitting there with my hands folded and the heater ticking as it cooled, that in less than 15 minutes, a stranger in a gray blazer was going to look at me the way you look at someone you're about to hand terrible news to. I did not know that the life I thought I understood, the marriage, the house, the money, the trust one had placed in the man I loved, was about to come apart in a conference room with beige carpet and a box of tissue someone had thoughtfully, almost prophetically, left on the table. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You should understand first how a woman ends up sitting in a parked car outside a bank, waiting for permission to know things about her own life. Richard and I met when we were 24. I was a junior accountant at a firm downtown, yes, an accountant, which will matter later, though not in the way you might expect, and he was an ambitious young loan officer with a smile that made older women trust him with their retirement savings within 10 minutes of meeting him. He was charming in that particular way some men are charming. Attentive when it served him, generous when it cost him little, and utterly convinced, underneath it all, that he was the smartest person in every room he entered. I fell for him anyway. Everyone does at first, with men like Richard. It isn't stupidity. It's hope. You believe the best version of someone is the true version, and you build a life around that belief before you ever get proof one way or the other. We married when I was 25. I kept working for the first few years. I was good at my job, better than good, and I liked the particular satisfaction of numbers that added up, of ledgers that balanced, of proof in black and white, that things made sense. But then came our son, Ethan, and 2 years later our daughter, Mia, and Richard's career at the bank was accelerating in a way mine could not with 2 small children and a husband who worked 12-hour days and came home too tired to so much as ask how mine had gone. "You don't need to work," he told me once, not unkindly in those early years. "Let me take care of things. That's what I want to do for you." I want to be fair to him, even now, even after everything. I don't think he said that to trap me. I think at 29 he believed it. I think he wanted, in his own limited way, to be the kind of man who provided so completely that his wife never had to worry about anything. The trouble is that never having to worry about anything and never being allowed to know anything can look identical from the outside, and it took me the better part of 2 decades to understand the difference. By the time our children were teenagers, Richard had left the bank and started his own financial consulting firm, Hale Capital Advisory, his name in gold letters on the glass door of a suite of offices on the 14th floor of a building downtown. He was good at it. Genuinely good. Clients trusted him. He had a gift for making people feel that their money in his hands was safer than it had ever been anywhere else. I handled the house. I handled the children's school schedules, their doctor's appointments, their college applications. I hosted his clients for dinner parties where I made conversation about wine and real estate and pretended not to notice when Richard corrected me in front of guests about things I actually knew more about than he did, because I had, after all, once balanced ledgers for a living, and he had once needed me to check his math. Somewhere in there, the corrections started to feel less like jokes and more like habits. Somewhere in there, Let me take care of things became, you wouldn't understand this became, eventually, a version of Richard who signed documents at the kitchen table with his laptop angled just slightly away from me, who took calls in his study with the door closed, who handled our finances with the tidy, sealed efficiency of a man managing a business I happened to be married to, but not, apparently, a partner in. I remember one dinner party in particular, though at the time I didn't understand why it stayed with me the way it did. It was maybe 14 years ago. Richard had invited a client, a developer named Thomas Whitfield, a big, booming man who liked to talk about capitalization rates the way other men talk about football, and his wife, a soft-spoken woman named Renee who spent most of the evening watching her husband the way you watch a pot you're worried might boil over. Somewhere between the entree and the dessert, the conversation turned to a proposed shopping center Whitfield was trying to finance, and he made an offhand comment about the debt service coverage ratio the banks were demanding, grumbling that it made the deal barely pencil. You could restructure the mezzanine piece, I said, before I'd fully thought about it, old instincts rising up the way they sometimes still did back then. If you push more of it into preferred equity instead of straight debt, you lower your coverage requirement without diluting your control position as much. There was a small silence. Whitfield blinked at me surprised, the way people are surprised when a piece of furniture speaks. And then Richard laughed. Not unkindly exactly, but in that particular tone he used when he wanted a room to know that something didn't need to be taken seriously. Claire dabbled in accounting years ago, he said, refilling Whitfield's wine glass. Before the kids. It's cute that she still remembers the vocabulary. Cute that she still remembers the vocabulary. I sat there with my napkin in my lap and I smiled, because that is what you do at dinner parties, and I let the conversation move on to something else, and I told myself driving home that night that it didn't matter, that Richard hadn't meant anything cruel by it, that I was being oversensitive. It was only years later, sitting in Diane Marshall's small office with a forged signature in front of me, that I understood what that comment had actually been. Not a joke. A boundary. A quiet, well-dressed way of telling a room, and telling me that whatever I had once known, whatever I might still understand, none of it counted anymore. That my expertise, my whole professional self, had been reclassified, sometime in our marriage, from asset to anecdote. I wonder now how many other small moments like that one I simply absorbed and let go, over 26 years, the way a hull absorbs water it doesn't yet realize is sinking it. I told myself this was normal. I told myself every long marriage has its divisions of labor, and mine simply happened to be that Richard did numbers and I did people. I told myself a great many things in those years, because it is easier to tell yourself things than to ask questions you're afraid of the answers to. The truth is, I stopped asking questions a long time before that Tuesday in March. And Richard, I think, had grown very comfortable with a wife who didn't ask. Our daughter Mia got married 2 years ago, to a kind, quiet man named Julian who works in software and treats her, from what I can see, the way a person should be treated, with attention, with respect, with the assumption that her opinions matter simply because they are hers. I remember standing at the edge of the reception, watching them dance, and feeling something I couldn't quite name at the time. It wasn't jealousy exactly. It was closer to grief. Grief for a version of marriage I had somehow let slip through my fingers without ever noticing the exact moment it happened. Our son Ethan lives 3 states away now, works in finance himself, a fact that pleases Richard enormously, though I sometimes wonder if Ethan chose that field because he loved it or because he'd spent his whole childhood watching his father be praised for it. So by the time that March came around, it was just Richard and me in the house on Aldridge Lane, the house my father had helped us buy the down payment for 31 years ago. Back when my father was still alive and still believed his daughter had married a man who would look after her the way he had. My father used to say that a man reveals himself completely in exactly 2 situations, when he's angry and when he's counting money. He never got the chance to see Richard do both at once. I sometimes think that was a mercy. The morning it started, Richard came downstairs already dressed, his phone in one hand, his car keys in the other, and told me, not asked me, told me, that we needed to go to the bank. What for? I asked, setting down my coffee. Just some paperwork. Refinancing details. It's boring, Claire. You don't need to be there for the whole thing. I want you to notice that sentence. You don't need to be there for the whole thing. Not you don't need to come. Not I can handle this alone. You don't need to be there for the whole thing. which meant, of course, that I was coming physically in the car, to the parking lot, to the building. I simply wasn't needed inside it. I should tell you my name since I haven't yet. It's Claire. Claire Hale, though for 26 years I had mostly answered to Richard's wife or Ethan and Mia's mom, or in the last decade, simply honey, said in the particular tired tone of a man asking you to pass the salt. Refinancing what? I asked. The house, he said, already moving toward the door. Standard stuff. Rates dropped. I want to lock in something better. You'll be bored out of your mind in there, trust me. Trust me. He said it lightly, the way you'd say don't worry about it or it's nothing, but something in the phrase caught on a rough edge somewhere in my chest, the way a sweater catches on a nail you didn't know was there. I didn't examine it. I got my coat. I got in the car. First Meridian Bank sat on the corner of Delancey and Ninth, a squat, respectable-looking building with brass letters on tinted glass doors. Richard parked, killed the engine, and reached for the door handle with the easy motion of a man who had done this 1,000 times. I'll be maybe 20 minutes, he said. Wait in the car. He was already halfway out of the seat when he said it. He didn't look at me. That's the detail I keep coming back to, even now. He didn't look at me when he said it. 26 years of marriage, and he delivered that sentence to the dashboard, to the windshield, to the general vicinity of the parking lot, not to my face. Richard, I said. He paused, 1 foot already on the pavement. What is it? I said. The refinancing. What's actually going on? I told you. Rates. Paperwork. A flash of something crossed his face. Irritation, maybe, or the particular impatience of a man who has already decided a conversation is over. It'll take longer if you come in and I have to explain every line to you. Just give me 20 minutes, Claire. Please. And then he was gone, walking briskly across the lot toward the glass doors, his gray coat flaring slightly behind him, his phone already lifting toward his ear as he walked, as though I had already ceased to exist the moment the car door closed. I sat there. The heater ticked as it cooled. Somewhere behind me a delivery truck idled, its exhaust curling up into the flat March sky. I looked at the clock on the dashboard. 9:47, 5 minutes, I told myself. I'll wait 5 minutes. I want to be honest with you about what I was feeling in that car, because I think it matters. I wasn't suspicious yet, not exactly. 26 years teaches you not to leap. What I felt, mostly, was a kind of small, familiar sadness. The sadness of being told, once again, that I wasn't needed for something that concerned my own house, my own name, my own life. I thought about my father. I thought about the check he'd written us all those years ago, for the down payment on this house, a house that was, on paper, in both our names, Richard's and mine, because my father had insisted on that, back when he still had the strength to insist on things. Both your names, he'd told Richard in that quiet, immovable way he had. Or no check. Richard had agreed easily back then. Of course, darling. Of course, both our names. I still remember the afternoon my father wrote that check. We were sitting at his kitchen table, a different kitchen table, in a different house, the house I grew up in, and Richard had brought the purchase agreement in a leather folder, proud of himself, ready to explain the terms the way he explained everything, as though the person across from him needed a tutorial. My father, a retired civil engineer who had built bridges for 31 years and did not particularly enjoy being lectured about numbers by a 30-year-old loan officer, listened patiently, and then set down his coffee and said, "Whose names are going on the deed?" "Mine," Richard said. "For the mortgage qualification, it's cleaner if..." "Both," my father said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't even really a suggestion. It was, I understood even then, a term of the transaction, delivered in the same flat, immovable tone he used when a contractor tried to cut corners on a bridge support. I'm not writing a check, so my daughter's name disappears off a piece of paper the moment she signs it. Both names, or you can find the down payment somewhere else. Richard had laughed it off, easily, charmingly. Of course, both our names. I wasn't trying to. I know what you weren't trying to do, my father said, in a voice that made it clear he suspected exactly what Richard hadn't been trying to do, and simply wasn't willing to let it happen on his watch. Both names, Richard. I hadn't thought about that conversation in years. But sitting in the car outside First Meridian, waiting for a husband who'd told me not to come inside, I thought about it very clearly. My father's flat, patient insistence, the small, stubborn protection he'd built into that house before he ever handed over a dollar. I thought about how grateful I was, suddenly and fiercely, that he had never fully trusted the ease of Richard's charm, even when I had. I wondered, sitting in that cold car 26 years later, when exactly both our names had started to feel in practice like just his. At 9:52, 6 minutes after he'd walked in, I almost turned the radio on out of habit and then didn't, because some part of me wanted to sit with the silence instead of covering it up. I watched a young couple walk out of the bank holding a folder of their own, laughing about something, her hand tucked into the crook of his arm, and I remember thinking, with a small, unexpected ache, that I couldn't recall the last time Richard and I had walked anywhere like that, easy, unhurried, matched to the same pace. At 9:55, I checked my phone. No messages. I thought about texting him, just to ask how much longer, just to have some small, legitimate reason for wanting to know what was happening inside a building I had, apparently, no other right to enter. I typed out "how's it going in there" and then deleted it before I sent it, because some old, tired part of me already knew what the answer would be. Fine. Almost done. Just a few more minutes. The same 3 sentences he'd been giving me, in one form or another, for years, about everything from bank meetings to late nights at the office to why he needed the study door closed. At 9:57, I thought about my father again. Not the specific memory of the down payment this time, but something smaller, older, from when I was maybe 9 years old, watching him check the math on a bridge inspection report a junior engineer had submitted. Never accept a number just because someone hands it to you with confidence, he told me, tapping the page. Confidence isn't the same thing as correct. If you can't verify it yourself, ask until someone shows you the work. I had spent 26 years accepting Richard's confidence in place of his work. I had never once asked him to show me. At 9:58, 11 minutes after Richard walked in, I got out of the car. I told myself I wasn't disobeying him. I told myself I simply needed to use the restroom, or that the car had gotten too cold, or any of a dozen small, forgivable reasons a woman might have for walking into a bank her husband had told her to wait outside of. I want you to understand that even then, even at 51 years old, with a career of my own once upon a time and 2 grown children and a lifetime of competence behind me, some small, trained part of me still felt the need to have an excuse ready. That, more than anything else that happened that day, is the detail that makes me saddest now. The lobby of First Meridian was quiet, hushed in that particular way banks are hushed, all soft carpet and low voices and the faint electronic hum of the currency counters behind the teller windows. I didn't see Richard right away. I scanned the room, the teller line, the little waiting area with its leather chairs and its rack of brochures about home equity lines of credit, and then a woman in a gray blazer, standing near a half-open door marked private consultation, caught my eye and went very still. She was maybe 40, with dark hair pulled back neatly, a lanyard around her neck that read D. Marshall, Senior Account Manager. She looked at me the way you look at someone whose photograph you've studied without ever expecting to meet them. "Mrs. Hale," she said. I blinked. Yes. Something shifted in her expression. Relief, maybe, or resolve, or both. She glanced quickly over her shoulder toward the consultation room, where I could just make out the shape of Richard's back through the frosted glass, hunched over a table, talking to someone I couldn't see. "Ma'am," she said, lowering her voice, stepping toward me with a kind of urgency that made my stomach tighten. "You need to see this. I want to slow down here, because I think about this moment more than any other moment in my life, and I want you to have it exactly as it happened." Her name was Diane Marshall. I know that now, though at that moment I only knew what her lanyard told me. She had a folder in her hand, a slim manila folder, the kind that looks unremarkable until you understand what's inside it. And she was holding it slightly away from her body, the way you hold something you're not entirely sure you're allowed to hand over, but have decided, in some private moral calculation of your own, that you're going to hand over anyway. "I've been trying to reach you for 3 days, she said quietly. "I left messages with your husband's office. I called the house twice. I wasn't sure." She stopped herself, glanced again at the frosted glass door. "Do you have a few minutes? Somewhere he can't see us." My mouth had gone dry. "What is this about?" "It's about an account under your name," Diane said. "And some paperwork that came through our fraud review department 2 weeks ago." Mrs. Hale, I need you to look at some documents, and I need you to tell me if you recognize your own signature on them. I followed her to a small private office 3 doors down from the consultation room where my husband was sitting, unaware, with his back to a frosted glass door, believing, as he had every reason to believe, given 26 years of precedent, that I was still sitting obediently in the car. Diane Marshall closed the door behind us and set the folder on the desk between us without opening it right away. She sat, folded her hands, and looked at me with an expression I would come to know very well over the following weeks. The particular, careful gentleness of a professional about to deliver news that will detonate someone's life, trying to time the fuse so it doesn't go off in her hands. Mrs. Hill, do you know a property called Birchwood Commons? A commercial retail development on the east side, near the interstate. I shook my head slowly. No, I don't think so. 3 months ago, your husband applied for a business expansion loan through this branch, $2.4 million, to acquire a majority stake in that development. The loan required collateral. He offered the house on Aldridge Lane. My chest tightened. That house is in both our names. Yes, Diane said. Which is exactly why the loan required both signatures. His and yours. She opened the folder. Inside was a loan application, thick with pages, tabbed with little yellow flags at each place a signature was required. She turned to the first flagged page and slid it toward me. There, at the bottom in blue ink, was a signature that said Claire E. Hale. I stared at it for a long moment. It was close. It was frighteningly close. The same slant, the same loop on the C, the same small flourish at the end I'd developed in my 20s and never changed. Close enough that if you glanced at it, you would believe it was mine. It was not mine. I reached into my bag, almost without thinking, and pulled out my checkbook, an old habit I'd never quite broken, carrying one even in an age when almost no one used them anymore, and I set it beside the forged page, open to a signed check from the week before, and I laid my own hand flat next to both of them, as though I needed the physical proof of my own fingers to believe what my eyes were already telling me. Look, I said quietly, sliding the checkbook toward Diane. Here. My actual signature. The C starts lower. It doesn't loop back on itself the same way. Whoever did this was good enough to fool a glance, but they weren't me. Diane leaned forward, studying the 2 signatures side by side, and something in her face confirmed what I already knew. You're right, she said slowly. It's close, but it's not a match. Our fraud team caught the same discrepancy, which is part of what triggered the review in the first place. Small pressure inconsistencies in the pen strokes that suggest someone tracing rather than signing naturally. Tracing. The word landed strangely, almost clinically, as though what had happened to me could be reduced to a forensic term and nothing more. But I understood, sitting there with my own real signature beside the false one, exactly what that word meant in practice, that somewhere, at some point, someone had taken an actual example of my handwriting, studied it closely enough to copy its shape, and reproduced it onto a legal document without ever once considering that the woman whose name it was still had a life, still had eyes, still might someday sit in a small office and be asked to look at her own signature and say, plainly, that is not me. I didn't sign this, I said again, my voice coming out steadier than I felt. I have never seen this document in my life. Diane nodded slowly, as though I had confirmed something she already suspected. That's what our fraud review flagged. The notary listed on this document, a man named Peter Kowalski, has had his license under investigation since January for exactly this kind of thing. Backdated notarizations. Signatures witnessed for clients who were never actually in the room. She turned another page. There are 4 documents in total with your signature on them, Mrs. Hale. All processed through Mr. Kowalski's office. All within the last 4 months. 4 months, I repeated. The loan closed 6 weeks ago, Diane said quietly. The funds were disbursed. Your husband has been making interest payments on it from a business account. But 2 weeks ago, our internal compliance team flagged Mr. Kowalski's notary stamp across several institutions, and every loan he processed is now under review, including this one. Which means technically right now, the collateral on a $2.4 million loan is a house that may not have been legally pledged at all, because the co-owner listed on the paperwork, she looked at me, never actually signed it. I sat very still. Somewhere down the hall, I knew. My husband was sitting in a room with his back to a frosted door, discussing rate locks with a loan officer, believing that the woman he had told to wait in the car was still sitting obediently in the parking lot, exactly where he'd left her. "Does he know you found this?" I asked. "No," Diane said. "We're required to notify all parties named on the document, and legally, that includes you, regardless of what your husband may or may not want you to know. I've been trying to reach you directly for 3 days because I did not feel comfortable routing this information exclusively through him." She hesitated. "I've seen this before, Mrs. Hale. Not often, but I've seen it. And I always try to make sure the person whose name is on the paper actually gets to see the paper." I looked down at the signature again. Claire E. Hale in someone else's hand, forging my consent to put my father's house, the house my father had insisted, be in both our names, on the line for a $2.4 million bet on a strip mall I had never heard of. "I need copies of everything," I said. My voice had gone very quiet, very flat. It was the voice I used to use 25 years ago when a client's numbers didn't balance and I had to tell them, gently but immovably, that something was wrong. Everything with my name on it. "And I need the name of the fraud investigator handling Mr. Kowalski's case." Diane looked at me for a long moment, and something in her face, relief, I think, or maybe respect, softened. "I'll have it printed in 5 minutes," she said. "Do you want me to interrupt the meeting?" "Let your husband know you're—" "No," I said. "Let him finish his meeting." I sat in that small office while Diane Marshall printed 23 pages of documentation, and I did not cry, and I did not shake, and I did not do any of the things I might have expected of myself. I felt, instead, a strange and total clarity, the specific, cold clarity of a woman who has just watched a lifetime of small, dismissed suspicions resolve, all at once, into a single, undeniable shape. I thought about every, "You don't need to be there for the whole thing." Every, "Let me handle it." Every door closed just slightly. Every laptop angled just slightly away. I thought about the vacation to the coast 8 months ago that Richard had insisted on paying for out of a business account. Don't worry about it. I thought about the new car he leased for himself in the fall, the office renovation that had cost more than our first house. I thought about 100 small moments I had swallowed, one at a time, because questioning them felt exhausting, felt confrontational, felt like more trouble than the marriage seemed worth fighting for on any given Tuesday. I thought about the fact that I used to be an accountant. That I used to be, in fact, quite good at exactly this, at reading a ledger, at spotting the place where a number didn't add up, at understanding, in a way most people never bother to learn, precisely how money moves and precisely how it hides. I had let myself forget that about myself. Richard had, very patiently, over 26 years, helped me forget it. I decided, sitting in that small office with 23 pages of forged documentation in a folder on my lap, that I was done forgetting. Diane walked me back toward the lobby, and as we passed the consultation room, the frosted glass door opened, and Richard stepped out, laughing at something the loan officer beside him had said, his phone already back in his hand. He saw me and stopped laughing. "Claire." His eyes went, very briefly, to the folder under my arm, then back to my face. "I thought I asked you to wait in the car." "You did," I said. "So what are you doing in here?" I looked at him, really looked at him, the way you look at someone after you've just learned something that recasts every memory you have of them, and I felt, for the first time in a very long while, entirely calm. "I got cold," I said. "I thought I'd come warm up." He studied me for a moment, some flicker of uncertainty crossing his face, quickly smoothed over by the easy confidence that had carried him through every room he'd ever walked into. "Well, I'm just about done here. Give me 2 more minutes." "Take your time," I said, and I smiled, the first real deliberate smile I had given him in months, though he had no idea, standing there in his gray coat with his phone in his hand, exactly what that smile meant. He didn't know. Not yet. The drive home was quiet. Richard talked about the refinancing rates, about a client dinner he had that Thursday, about whether we should repaint the guest bathroom before Ethan's visit next month. I said, "I'm in the right places." I looked out the window at the gray March trees, still bare, still waiting for spring, and I thought about the folder now hidden in my bag, tucked beneath my wallet and a half-used pack of tissues, 23 pages that were going to change the rest of both our lives. I did not confront him in the car. "I want you to understand why," because I know some of you reading this would have. Some of you would have turned in your seat the moment the car doors closed and demanded an explanation right there in the parking lot. I understand that impulse. I even respect it. But I had spent 26 years learning exactly how my husband operated, and I knew, with the same cold clarity I'd felt in Diane Marshall's office, that confronting him without a plan would accomplish nothing except giving him time to prepare a defense, to soften me with an explanation, to do what he had always done, which was talk his way around the hard edges of a problem until it seemed smaller than it was. I was not going to let this seem smaller than it was. So I said I'm in the right places, and I asked whether he thought a soft gray or a warm white would suit the guest bathroom better, and inside, very quietly, I began to build the case that was going to end my marriage, and though I did not know it yet, quite possibly send my husband to prison. Asterisk, I called my father's old attorney the next morning from the car in the grocery store parking lot, with the windows up and the radio off. His name was Harold Fenwick, and he had helped my father with the estate paperwork years ago, and though he had to be nearly 75 by now, I remembered him as sharp, careful, and entirely unimpressed by wealthy men who assumed they were smarter than everyone in the room. "Claire Hill," he said when his secretary put me through. "It's been years. How's your mother's? No, wait, I remember she passed. I'm sorry. My memory isn't what it used to be. What can I do for you?" I told him everything. The bank. The folder. The signature that wasn't mine. There was a long silence on the line. "Bring me copies of every page," he said finally, his voice entirely different now, clipped, precise, the voice of a man who has spent 50 years watching families destroy each other over money and has stopped being surprised by any of it. "Don't tell your husband you have them. Don't tell him you've spoken to me. And Claire, do you have access to your own bank accounts? Separate from his?" "I have a small savings account. From before we married. Move whatever's in the joint accounts that you're legally entitled to move. Not all of it, don't panic him, just enough to protect yourself. Into that account today, quietly. And then come see me Thursday morning. First thing." "What is this, Harold? Really? What am I looking at?" Another pause. "If what you're describing is accurate," he said slowly, "your husband forged your signature on federal loan documents to pledge collateral you never agreed to pledge. That's not a marital dispute, Claire. That's bank fraud. And depending on how deep it goes, it might not just be his problem anymore. It might be a problem for whoever else signed off on those documents with him." I sat in that parking lot for a long time after we hung up, watching people push their carts across the wet asphalt, ordinary people buying ordinary groceries, none of them knowing that 6 feet away, inside a 15-year-old sedan, a woman's entire understanding of her own life had just been rearranged. Asterisk, over the following 2 weeks, I became someone I hadn't been in a very long time, quiet, methodical, watchful. I did not accuse Richard of anything. I did not change my behavior in any way he might notice. I made his coffee. I asked about his day. I let him believe entirely that the woman who had gotten cold in a bank lobby had simply gotten cold in a bank lobby and nothing more. But in the mornings after he left for the office, I sat at the kitchen table with my old laptop and I did what I used to be good at. I pulled bank statements. I traced the business account he thought I didn't have access to, a joint account I was legally entitled to view, whether he liked it or not, because his own carelessness or arrogance had never bothered to remove my name from it. I found the disbursement from the Birchwood Commons loan. I traced it forward. $2.4 million, wired into a Hale Capital Advisory operating account 6 weeks earlier. From there, I found $600,000 transferred within days to something called Meridian Retail Partners LLC, a company that, when I looked it up, had been formed only 4 months prior, with a registered agent I didn't recognize and a listed address that turned out to be a UPS store 2 towns over. I found 4 payments, each just under $10,000, to a woman named Priya Anand, amount small enough, I would later learn, to sit just beneath the threshold that would have triggered automatic reporting had anyone but me been paying attention. I did not know who Priya Anand was yet. I would find out. I found a payment of $41,000 to Peter Kowalski Notary Services, the same Kowalski whose license was under state investigation, the man whose signature had appeared invalid on documents bearing my forged name. I sat at my kitchen table, in the house my father had insisted be in both our names, and I built a spreadsheet. I hadn't built one in over 20 years, but the skill came back the way riding a bicycle comes back. Clumsy at first, and then, within an hour, entirely fluent, as if some part of me had simply been waiting, patiently, for permission to remember what I used to be. Harold Fenwick's office smelled like old books and coffee that had been reheated one too many times. He read through the documents I brought him, the loan paperwork, my spreadsheet, the bank statements, with the slow, careful attention of a man who had learned, over decades, that the difference between winning and losing a case often lived in details other people had been too impatient to notice. "This is thorough," he said finally, looking up at me over his glasses. "Genuinely thorough, Claire. Where did you learn to build something like this?" "I used to be an accountant," I said. "A long time ago." "Well," he tapped the spreadsheet. "It shows." He explained the situation to me plainly, the way I had always appreciated about him. The forged signatures were, on their own, serious enough fraud, potentially felony fraud, depending on how the district attorney's office chose to pursue it, especially given that Kowalski's notary license was already under separate investigation, which meant the state was likely to take an interest regardless of what I decided to do personally. But the money, the $600,000 to a shell company, the payments to a woman named Priya Anand, that was a different matter. That was, Harold said carefully, watching my face as he said it, the kind of thing that usually points toward one of two explanations. Either your husband is funding something he doesn't want traced back to Hale Capital's books, or he's funding someone. "You think it's an affair," I said. My voice was steadier than I expected. "I think," Harold said, "that you should find out before you decide anything else. Because it changes what kind of case we're building, and it changes, frankly, what kind of divorce we're building if that's the direction you choose to go." I thought of Richard laughing in the doorway of that consultation room, phone in hand, utterly unbothered, utterly confident that the woman he'd told to wait in the car had simply waited in the car, exactly as instructed, for 26 years. "Find out," I said. "I want to know everything before I do anything." I hired a private investigator, a quiet, unremarkable woman named Renata who came recommended by Harold and who looked, when I met her, exactly like someone you would never notice in a parking lot, which I suspect was the entire point. We met at a coffee shop 2 towns over, far enough from Aldridge Lane that I didn't have to worry about running into anyone who might mention it to Richard. Renata ordered black coffee, pulled out a small notebook, and looked at me with an expression that was neither warm nor cold, simply attentive, the way a good doctor looks at you before delivering a diagnosis. "Harold tells me you found some transfers," she said. $600,000 to a shell company. 4 payments, just under $10,000 each, to a woman named Priya Anand. I slid a printed page across the table, my spreadsheet, the dates and amounts highlighted in yellow. "I need to know who she is." Renata studied the page for a long moment. "Do you want the truth, even if it's ugly?" Some clients say that and then don't mean it. "I've spent 3 weeks staring at my husband's forged signature of my own name," I said. "I don't think there's much left that could surprise me." She almost smiled at that. "There's always something left that surprises you," she said. "But I'll get you the truth, whatever it is. That's what you're paying for." She asked me questions I hadn't expected. Not just about Richard's finances, but about his schedule, his habits, which nights he claimed to have client dinners, which weekends he'd started golfing more frequently over the past year. And I remember feeling, oddly, a kind of relief in it, the relief of finally being asked questions by someone whose entire job was to actually listen to the answers. "Give me a week and a half," Renata said, closing her notebook. "Maybe less. And Mrs. Hale, in my experience, once you go looking for this kind of thing, it tends to unfold faster than people expect. Be ready for that." It took her 9 days. Priya Anand, it turned out, was 34 years old, worked as a leasing consultant, and had, until 4 months ago, worked directly for the development company behind Birchwood Commons, the very property Richard had taken out a $2.4 million loan to help acquire. She had left that job the same month the loan closed. She had moved, 3 weeks later, into a 2-bedroom condominium 11 miles from our house, a condominium whose deposit and first 3 months' rent had been paid. Renata's documentation showed clearly, from an account traceable back to those small, careful transfers I had already found. There were photographs. I won't describe them in detail, because some things a person is entitled to keep for herself, even in a story like this one. I will tell you that they were enough. I will tell you that I sat at my kitchen table alone on a Thursday afternoon while Richard was at the office, and I looked through Renata's report from beginning to end without crying, without shouting, without doing anything except turning each page with the same steady, careful hands I used to turn ledger pages with 25 years ago, checking, one line at a time, to see exactly where the numbers stopped adding up. They had stopped adding up a long time before that Tuesday in March. I had simply never had the folder in front of me. I sat at that kitchen table for nearly 2 hours after I finished reading, watching the light change outside the window, from the flat gray of afternoon into the deeper gray of early evening, and I did something I hadn't done in years. I made a list on a legal pad, the old-fashioned way, exactly the way my father taught me to organize a problem before you try to solve it. On the left side, I wrote everything I knew for certain. On the right side, I wrote everything I still needed to find out. It was, I realize now, the same instinct that had once made me good at my job. The refusal to let a feeling stand in for a fact. The insistence on separating what you can prove from what you merely suspect. By the time Richard's car pulled into the driveway that evening, I had folded the legal pad closed, tucked Renata's report into the bottom drawer of my father's old desk, and set the table for dinner as though it were any other Thursday. He came in tired, loosening his tie, and asked what smelled so good, and I told him it was the chicken, and he kissed my cheek on his way to wash up, entirely unaware that the woman he'd just kissed had spent the better part of the afternoon reading documented proof of an apartment he'd been paying for with money forged out of her own name. Renata called me that evening, after I'd had a few hours to sit alone with what I'd read. Her voice was careful, gentler than it had been at the coffee shop. "I know this is a lot," she said. "Some clients want to talk it through right away. Some need a few days. There's no right way to do this, Mrs. Hale. How long has it been going on?" I asked. "Can you tell that from what you found?" "Based on the lease dates and the first transfers, I'd estimate somewhere between 5 and 6 months, she said. "Before that, I can't say for certain. I only pulled what the money trail could show me. 5 or 6 months. I did the arithmetic without meaning to, the way I do arithmetic on almost everything now, an old habit that had simply been waiting, patiently, for a reason to come back online. 5 or 6 months put the beginning of it right around the time Richard had started renovating his office, right around the time he'd started golfing on Thursdays instead of Saturdays, right around 100 small adjustments to his schedule I had noticed and, true to form, had not questioned. "Thank you," I told Renata, "for being thorough, and for being honest with me instead of softening it." "That's the job," she said simply. "Take care of yourself, Mrs. Hale. This part is always the hardest part. It gets more manageable once you're actively doing something about it instead of just sitting with it." She was right, though it didn't feel that way yet. I remember hanging up the phone and standing in my kitchen for a long time, looking at the framed photographs on the wall by the pantry. Ethan's high school graduation, Mia's wedding, a family trip to the coast we'd taken when the kids were still small enough to be carried on shoulders. I looked at Richard's face in each one, that same easy, confident smile he wore in every photograph he'd ever been part of, and I tried to find the exact moment, somewhere in 26 years of frozen images, where the man in the pictures had started keeping a whole second life just out of frame. I couldn't find it. I don't think there was one single moment. I think it happened the way most betrayals happen, gradually in small increments, each one so minor on its own that it never seemed worth questioning, until one day the increments added up to an apartment 11 miles away and a signature that wasn't mine. Asterisk, I did not confront Richard the day I received Renata's report. I want you to understand that this was not weakness. It was, I think, the truest strength I have ever exercised in my life. The discipline to sit with the worst news of my marriage for 6 more days, to keep making his coffee, to keep asking about his day, while Harold Fenwick and I quietly assembled everything we needed. Those 6 days remain, even now, some of the strangest of my life. I remember standing at the stove on the second night, making the same chicken dish I'd made 100 times before, while Richard sat at the kitchen table telling me in some detail about a difficult client meeting, entirely unaware that the woman ladling sauce onto his plate had, less than 48 hours earlier, looked at photographs documenting the apartment he'd paid for with money forged out of her own name. I remember he complimented the dish. I remember I said thank you. I remember thinking, with a clarity that almost frightened me, how easy it had become, how easy it had always been, apparently, to hold two entirely separate truths in my hands at once and let neither one show on my face. There was a night, the fourth of those 6, when he reached across the table and took my hand unprompted and said, "I know I've been distracted lately. Work's been a lot. I want you to know I appreciate you, Claire." I don't say it enough. I let him hold my hand. I did not pull away. I did not say what I was thinking, which was that appreciation from a man who has forged your signature onto a multi-million-dollar loan is not the comfort he seems to believe it is. I simply said, "I know you do," and I meant it in a way he could not possibly have understood. I did know exactly what he appreciated, and exactly how far he was willing to go to protect it, and exactly how little regard he'd shown in the process for what I might have wanted to know. We moved money. Legally, carefully, everything documented, nothing that could later be characterized as theft or concealment on my part, because Harold was very clear that whatever else happened, my hands needed to be entirely clean. We filed a formal notice with First Meridian Bank disputing the forged signatures, which triggered, as Diane Marshall had warned it might, a full internal fraud review. One that would eventually be handed, given Peter Kowalski's already compromised notary license, to the district attorney's office. We drafted divorce paperwork. Not filed yet. Harold was insistent that timing mattered, that I needed to file only once every piece was in place, so Richard would have no window in which to move assets, hide accounts, or otherwise soften the landing he so richly deserved. And we prepared for the one conversation Harold said I was owed, more than anything else, the chance to look my husband in the eye and tell him, calmly, precisely, exactly how much I knew. Asterisk, it happened on a Sunday evening 3 weeks after that Tuesday at the bank. Richard had come home from golf, pleased with himself in the particular way he got pleased with himself after a good round, and he was pouring himself a scotch in the kitchen when I set a folder on the counter between us. Not the folder from the bank. A folder of my own. Copies of everything. The forged loan documents. My spreadsheet, printed clean, every transfer labeled, every date stamped. Renata's report. Photographs removed, but the financial trail intact. A printed notice from First Meridian confirming the fraud dispute I'd filed. Richard looked at the folder, then at me, and I watched something in his face begin, very slowly, to understand. "What is this?" he said. It wasn't really a question. His voice had gone quiet in a way I'd almost never heard from him. "Open it," I said. He didn't move for a long moment. Then he set down his scotch and he opened the folder, and I watched my husband of 26 years go through 23 pages of his own carefully hidden life, one document at a time, his face draining of color with each page, the same way, I imagine, mine had drained of color 3 weeks earlier in a small office off a bank lobby. "Claire," he said finally, and there was something almost pleading in it now, something I had not heard from him in years. "Let me explain. You told me to wait in the car," I said. My voice was very calm. I had practiced this in the mirror more times than I would ever admit to anyone. "For 26 years, Richard, you have told me, in 100 different ways, to wait in the car. And I did. I waited while you built a business. I waited while you decided what I needed to know and what I didn't. I waited while you forged my name onto documents that put my father's house, the house he insisted be in both our names, because even he didn't trust you completely, on the line for a loan you used, in part, to fund an apartment for a woman 11 miles from here." His face went white. "You know about—" "I know everything," I said. "I know about Priya. I know about the $600,000. I know about Meridian Retail Partners and the UPS store it's registered to. I know about Peter Kowalski's notary stamp and the fact that his license is under state investigation for exactly this kind of forgery. I know, Richard, because I used to be very good at reading numbers, and you made the mistake somewhere along the way of assuming I'd forgotten how." He sank into a chair, both hands pressed flat against his forehead, and for a long moment he didn't say anything at all. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost every trace of the confident, room-filling quality I had married 26 years earlier. "How long have you known?" 3 weeks, I said. 3 weeks of making your coffee. 3 weeks of asking about your day. 3 weeks of watching you compliment my cooking and reach for my hand across this exact table, while I already knew everything you're only now realizing I know. 3 weeks, he repeated, almost to himself, as though the number itself was its own kind of betrayal. You sat across from me for 3 weeks and never said a word. I learned patience from you, Richard, I said. 26 years of being told to wait for explanations you never fully gave me. I simply used it for something you didn't expect. He looked up at me then, and for just a moment, I saw something in his face I hadn't seen in years. Not the polished confidence, not the practiced charm, but something raw, something almost frightened. What happens now? Now, I said, you call your attorney. Because the fraud complaint is already filed, the divorce paperwork is already drafted, and my accounts are already protected. There is nothing left for you to hide, and nothing left for you to manage on my behalf. For the first time in 26 years, Richard, you're going to have to sit with a version of events you don't get to shape. He didn't say anything else that night. He sat at the table for a long time after I went upstairs, the folder open in front of him, the scotch untouched beside it, and when I came down the next morning he was gone, to a hotel, I later learned, the first of several he would move through over the following months, each one a little smaller, a little less impressive than the one before it. He sat down heavily at the kitchen table, our kitchen table, where I had raised 2 children and hosted 100 dinner parties and, 3 weeks earlier, built a spreadsheet that was about to end his marriage and possibly his freedom. I can fix this, he said. The loan. I can restructure it, pay it back faster. I can clear if you go to the police with the forgery. I could lose my license. I could lose everything. The kids. Think about what this does to the kids. I thought about the kids, I said. I thought about them the whole 3 weeks I sat with this. And I decided that what I owe them is not a mother who protects their father from the consequences of forging her name on federal loan documents. What I owe them is a mother who shows them what it looks like when a person finally stops waiting in the car. Richard's mother, Eleanor, had never much cared for me. She was polite about it, in the practiced way of women who consider open rudeness beneath them, but for 26 years I had understood, without either of us ever saying it aloud, that in Eleanor Hale's eyes, I had never quite been enough for her son. Not glamorous enough, not connected enough, not, in some fundamental way she could never articulate but always implied, worthy of the Hale name she had spent her own marriage building into something. She called me 4 days after the confrontation in the kitchen, her voice tight and formal. Richard tells me you're divorcing him, she said without preamble. Over some paperwork misunderstanding at the bank. Is that what he told you? I said. A misunderstanding? Claire, whatever's happened, surely it can be worked out privately. 26 years is a long time to throw away over a business matter. Eleanor, I said, and I found, to my own quiet surprise, that my voice was perfectly calm. Your son forged my signature on federal loan documents to pledge my father's house as collateral for a loan he used, in part, to fund an apartment for a woman he was having an affair with. That isn't a business matter. That's fraud and betrayal, in roughly equal measure. There was a long silence on the line, long enough that I wondered if she'd hung up. He wouldn't do that, she said finally, but something in her voice had changed, gone thinner, less certain. I have the documents, Eleanor. I have the bank's own fraud review confirming it. I have photographs of the apartment and the woman living in it. I'm not telling you this to hurt you. I'm telling you because I think, somewhere underneath 60 years of believing your son can do no wrong, you deserve to know the truth as clearly as I had to learn it. She didn't call again for nearly 2 months. When she finally did, her voice was different, quieter, smaller, stripped of the formal edge she'd always kept between us. I saw the paperwork, she said. Harold sent copies to Richard's attorney, and Richard's attorney showed them to me. I think because he wanted someone else to share the burden of believing it. A pause. I owe you an apology, Claire. I spent 26 years thinking you weren't quite good enough for my son. I never once considered that he might not be good enough for you. I didn't forgive her instantly. That kind of forgiveness doesn't arrive on command, no matter how sincerely it's asked for. But I told her I appreciated her saying it, and I meant it, and in the years since, we have built something quieter and more honest than what we had before. She sends me a card every year on my birthday now. She never used to. I want to tell you that Richard fought hard against everything that followed, and in some ways he did. There were lawyers, there were long silences at family dinners, there was a period of nearly 4 months where Ethan, at least at first, sided instinctively with his father. the way sons sometimes do, until he read the documentation himself and went very quiet on the phone with me for a long time before finally saying, "Mom, I'm so sorry. I didn't know." There was a stretch of about 6 weeks early on when Richard tried a different approach entirely. He stopped denying anything and started, instead, appealing to me directly, showing up unannounced at the house with flowers he knew I didn't even particularly like, leaving voicemails that alternated between contrition and a kind of wounded confusion, as though he genuinely could not understand why a woman would be upset about having her signature forged onto a multimillion-dollar loan. "I built that company for us," he said, standing in the driveway one evening in April, his hands shoved in his coat pockets, his breath fogging in the cold. "Everything I did, the loan, all of it, it was supposed to secure our future, Claire. Our retirement. I made a mistake with how I handled the paperwork, I'll admit that, but you have to understand the intention behind it." "You forged my name," I said. "There's no version of intention that makes that a paperwork issue, Richard. If you go forward with the fraud complaint, I could lose my license entirely. I could go to prison. Is that really what you want? For the father of your children." I looked at him for a long moment. Really looked, the way I'd learned to over the previous weeks, past the charm, past the practiced wounded expression, down to the calculation underneath it, the same calculation, I now understood, that had been running underneath most of our marriage without my ever quite seeing it. "What I want," I said, "is for you to understand that the consequences you're facing were never something I did to you. They are something you did to yourself for different times, each time you signed my name to a document I never saw. I'm not going to carry the weight of protecting you from that. I carried enough for you for 26 years. He tried Ethan next, I later learned, calling him, explaining his version of events, hoping, I think, that a son's loyalty might do what a wife's guilt hadn't. It worked for a little while. Ethan called me that spring sounding cautious, almost accusatory, asking whether I'd really thought this through, whether I understood what this could do to Dad's career. I sent him copies of everything. Not to weaponize him against his father. I want to be clear about that. But because I believed, and still believe, that grown children deserve the truth rather than a curated version of it designed to protect one parent at the other's expense. He called me back 4 days later, and this time his voice was different. Quieter, younger somehow, the voice he'd had as a boy when he broke something and didn't know how to say sorry for it. "Mom," he said. I read all of it. The signature, I compared it to your real one side by side. I could see it wasn't yours. "I'm so sorry. I should have believed you from the start, instead of asking if you'd thought it through." A long pause. "You did more thinking through this than anyone I've ever known." That was, I think, the moment I finally allowed myself to cry. Not in front of Richard, not in front of Eleanor, not even in front of Harold Fenwick, but alone in my kitchen, on the phone with my son, 26 years of swallowed exhaustion, finally finding somewhere safe to land. But in the ways that mattered most, Richard didn't have much fight left in him at all, because the forged signatures were not a matter of opinion. Diane Marshall's fraud review at First Meridian moved forward regardless of anything either of us wanted, and once Peter Kowalski's notary practice came under formal state investigation, every document he had ever processed came under scrutiny, including four with my forged name on them, time-stamped, cross-referenced, undeniable. I sat across a conference table from 2 investigators from the district attorney's office in June, in a room not unlike the one Diane Marshall had first pulled me into, and I answered their questions plainly, the way I'd learned, once a long time ago, to lay out a set of numbers so clearly that no one in the room could argue with what they showed. I did not embellish. I did not need to. The documents did the work themselves. "You understand," one of the investigators said gently near the end, "that a case like this can move slowly, and it can be difficult for the person at the center of it. Are you prepared for that?" I thought of 11 minutes in a cold car, and a folder held slightly away from a stranger's body, and a lifetime of being told to wait. "I've had a great deal of practice being patient," I said. "I can wait for this too." The district attorney's office did, eventually, bring charges. Not the kind that make headlines, not the kind involving handcuffs on a courthouse staircase, but real charges nonetheless. Forgery, and a related fraud count tied to the falsified collateral. It took the better part of a year for the case to work its way through pretrial motions, discovery, and negotiation, and there were weeks during that year when I genuinely wondered whether it would ever resolve at all, whether Richard's attorneys, expensive, aggressive, exactly the kind of legal team a man like Richard would hire, might simply outweigh the whole system until it gave up from exhaustion. They didn't in the end, because the evidence didn't allow for it. Peter Kowalski, facing his own mounting exposure across dozens of fraudulent notarizations, eventually agreed to cooperate with investigators rather than fight every case individually, and his cooperation confirmed, in his own words, exactly what I had already proven with a spreadsheet at my kitchen table, that Richard had brought him the documents already signed, or rather, already forged, and paid him to notarize a signature he had never actually witnessed. I attended the plea hearing in October, 19 months after that Tuesday in the parking lot. I sat 3 rows back, between Harold and, somewhat to my surprise, Ethan, who had flown in without telling me in advance, simply appearing at my door the night before with a small overnight bag and the words, "I didn't want you sitting there alone." Richard stood at the defense table in a suit I recognized, one I had once picked out for him myself years ago, for a client dinner neither of us could now remember the details of, and he did not look at me once during the proceeding. He looked at the judge. He looked at his attorney. He looked, mostly, at the table in front of him, at his own hands, the same hands that had once signed my name onto 4 separate documents without ever once considering that I might, someday, be the one to find them. The judge's questions were brief and procedural. Richard's answers were quiet, clipped, entirely unlike the confident, room-filling voice I had lived beside for 26 years. Guilty, 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 guilty. 4 times. 4 forged documents. 4 small words that undid, in under 2 minutes, a version of himself he had spent decades constructing. Afterward, in the hallway outside the courtroom, Ethan put his arm around my shoulders, and I realized, standing there, that I felt neither triumphant nor devastated. I felt mostly finished, the particular hollowed-out relief of setting down something heavy you have carried so long you'd nearly forgotten it had weight. Richard's attorney negotiated a plea that kept him out of prison but did not keep him out of a felony record, a suspended state financial license, and a restitution order that, combined with the divorce settlement Harold Fenwick negotiated on my behalf, took nearly everything Richard had built at Hale Capital Advisory and redirected it, appropriately I think, toward the wife whose name he had forged and whose house he had nearly lost on a $2.4 million bet on a strip mall she had never even heard of. I kept the house on Aldridge Lane, fully cleanly in my name alone, exactly as my father would have wanted, though he never lived to see it happen this way. Priya Anand, for what it's worth, left the state a few months later. I don't know what became of Richard's relationship with her once the money that had funded it disappeared into restitution payments and legal fees. I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I didn't much care. People ask me sometimes. The few friends I told the full story to, the handful who watched me go through the divorce and the investigation and the slow, strange work of rebuilding a life at 51, whether I regret not confronting Richard the moment I stepped out of that bank 3 weeks earlier. Whether all that quiet, careful waiting cost me something. I tell them the truth, which is that the waiting was the point. 26 years of being told to wait in the car had taught me a great many things I didn't ask to learn, but it had also, without my noticing, taught me patience. Real patience, the kind that doesn't erupt, the kind that builds a case one document at a time and doesn't tip its hand until every piece is exactly where it needs to be. I think about Diane Marshall sometimes, the bank manager who could have simply routed that folder through Richard's office, the way I suspect he expected, and instead chose to find me directly, because some quiet, stubborn sense of fairness in her wouldn't let her hand a woman's financial fate to the very man who had forged her signature onto it. I did eventually work up the nerve to walk back into First Meridian Bank, nearly 2 years after that first Tuesday, on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon, with no folder in my bag this time. Nothing to dispute, nothing to prove. I asked the teller if Diane Marshall still worked there, half expecting to be told she'd moved on, the way people so often do. She hadn't. She came out from behind the partition a few minutes later, and I watched recognition cross her face slowly, then fully, and something like relief settle into it. "Mrs. Hill," she said, "I've wondered about you." I wasn't sure I was allowed to wonder, given how things work here, but I did. We ended up at a small coffee shop across the street on her lunch break, and I told her everything. The investigator, the divorce, the plea hearing, the certification course, the consulting work I did now, the very kind of work that had first let me recognize what was wrong with a signature that was almost, but not quite, my own. I want you to know something, I told her, which is that what you did that day took a real risk. You could have just processed the paperwork the way it was routed to you. Most people would have. Diane turned her coffee cup slowly on the table, not quite meeting my eyes. I had a case years before yours that I handled the other way, she said quietly. Routed it exactly the way it was supposed to be routed, husband first, and by the time the wife found out what had happened to her name on a piece of paper, it was too late to do anything about it cleanly. I've never forgotten what her face looked like when she finally understood. I told myself after that I'd never let it happen that way again if I could help it. So when your husband's file crossed my desk, and I saw Kowalski's notary stamp, and I pulled the compliance flag, I just knew. I wasn't going to make that same mistake twice. I think about that conversation often. The idea that somewhere behind every folder, every signature, every quiet Tuesday morning transaction, there are people making small, private decisions about fairness that the rest of us never see, and that sometimes, if we're fortunate, one of those decisions lands squarely in our favor at exactly the moment we need it most. I sent her a note months later, after everything was finalized. I never heard back at first, though after our coffee that Wednesday I understood why. She told me, laughing slightly, that the bank's compliance department discouraged personal correspondence with former case subjects, and that she'd kept my note anyway in a drawer at home, because some things were worth a small rule broken quietly. I like to think she still has it. I sold the guest bathroom repaint idea to no one in the end. I repainted it myself, that spring, a warm, confident white, the kind of color that makes a room feel like it belongs entirely to whoever's standing in it. Ethan came to visit that summer, and he sat with me at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd laid out that folder, the same table where Richard's face had drained of color, and he told me he was proud of me, in a voice that cracked slightly in the middle, the way a grown son's voice cracks when he's realizing, for the first time, that his mother is a whole and separate person with a history he never fully understood. Mia cried when I told her the full story, and then, after a long silence, she laughed, a strange, surprised laugh, and said, "Mom, you basically did forensic accounting on Dad and took him down with a spreadsheet." I told her that was, more or less, exactly what happened. Asterisk, I want to tell you what happened to me specifically after the dust settled, because I think it matters as much as anything else in this story. For a long time, I didn't know who I was outside of being Richard's wife. That's not self-pity. It's simply arithmetic, the same kind of plain accounting I've always trusted more than feelings. I had spent 26 years arranging my days around a man's schedule, a man's needs, a man's version of what our household required. When the marriage ended, there was a strange, disorienting silence where all of that used to be. Hours in the day I didn't know what to do with, a version of myself I had to relearn almost from scratch, the way you relearn to walk after an injury that's kept you still for a very long time. Harold Fenwick, of all people, was the one who suggested it. "You built that spreadsheet like it was nothing," he said, during one of our final meetings to close out the settlement. "Have you ever thought about doing that kind of work again? There are firms that specialize in exactly this, forensic accounting, fraud investigation. People like you, who can read a ledger the way other people read a room." I laughed at first. 51 years old, 26 years out of the workforce, and he wanted me to start a new career built on the very skill my ex-husband had spent decades quietly convincing me was cute, outdated, a hobby from before the kids. But I thought about it. And then I thought about it more. And that autumn, I enrolled in a certification course 2 nights a week, sitting in a classroom full of people 20 and 30 years younger than me, relearning software that hadn't existed the last time I'd done this work professionally, and finding, to my genuine surprise, that the old instincts were still there underneath the rust, the particular, quiet satisfaction of watching a column of numbers resolve into a clear and undeniable truth. I passed my certification the following spring. I do consulting work now, mostly for small firms and occasionally, through a referral network Harold connected me to, for attorneys building exactly the kind of case I once had to build for myself, reading through financial records, finding the places where the numbers don't add up, the shell companies, the payments just under the reporting threshold, the small careful patterns that people believe, wrongly, that no one else will ever bother to trace. My first solo case, 6 months into the work, involved a husband who had spent 3 years quietly diverting business revenue into an account his wife didn't know existed. I found it in 11 days. When I handed my report to the attorney and later, in a much smaller and gentler way, when I sat with the wife herself and walked her through what the numbers actually meant, I felt something settle into place inside me that I hadn't felt in a very long time. The sense of being useful in exactly the way I was built to be useful, not the diminished, decorative usefulness Richard had assigned me for 26 years. But the real thing, the thing my father always said I had a gift for, back. Before I let a charming young loan officer convince me to set it aside. I still live in the house on Aldridge Lane. I repainted more than just the guest bathroom. Eventually, the whole house, room by room, over the better part of a year. Each color chosen entirely by me, for reasons that belonged entirely to me. My father's old roll-top desk sits in what used to be Richard's study, and some mornings I sit at it with a cup of coffee in my laptop, going through a client's records, and I think about how strange it is that a room Richard once closed doors inside of to keep things from me is now the room where I do the work of uncovering exactly the kind of thing he once hid. Ethan visits twice a year now, sometimes more. Mia and Julian had their first child last spring. A daughter, whom they named after my mother, a gesture that undid me completely the first time I heard it. I hold her sometimes on Sunday afternoons, and I think about the version of myself who sat in a cold car 11 minutes longer than she needed to, too well trained to simply walk in, and I want, very badly, for this small girl to never learn that particular kind of waiting. Richard remarried within 2 years, not Priya, as it turned out. That relationship, unsurprisingly, didn't survive the collapse of the money that had funded it. I hear about his life secondhand, through Ethan mostly, in fragments I don't go looking for and don't particularly need. He rebuilt something smaller than what he had before. I understand he still tells people, when the subject comes up, that our marriage ended over some paperwork misunderstanding. I've stopped being surprised by his ability to shrink the truth down to a size he can carry comfortably. I don't think about him nearly as often as you might expect, given everything. Mostly I think about Diane Marshall, still, all these years later, a woman I met exactly once, for perhaps 20 minutes, who could have quietly let a forged signature pass through the system the way Richard clearly expected it to, and instead chose, at some real professional risk to herself, to make sure the actual owner of that name got to see it with her own eyes. I like to imagine there's a version of this story playing out in banks all across the country. Right now, today, a woman sitting in a parked car waiting, the way I waited, not yet knowing that 11 minutes away, someone is about to hand her a folder that will change everything. I hope, if that woman exists, that she gets out of the car sooner than I did. I think about that Tuesday morning often. The gray light, the ticking heater, the 11 minutes I sat in that parked car before I decided, for reasons I still can't fully explain, to walk in anyway. I think about how close I came to simply waiting the full 20 minutes, the way I'd waited for 26 years, the way I might have kept waiting indefinitely if a stranger in a gray blazer hadn't decided that a woman's own name deserved to be shown to her directly. I think, too, about what it means that the moment my whole life changed wasn't a scream or a slammed door or a dramatic confrontation. It was a quiet woman in a bank lobby, lowering her voice, saying 5 words that split my life cleanly into before and after. Mem, you need to see this. I did need to see it. I needed to see all of it. The forged signature, the shell company, the apartment 11 miles away, the 26 years of small, patient dismissals that had made it possible for a man to believe, right up until the moment I set a folder on a kitchen counter, that his wife would simply keep waiting in the car forever. She wouldn't. I didn't. These days, when I drive past First Meridian Bank, and I do, occasionally, since it's on the way to the pharmacy, I think of that Wednesday afternoon coffee with Diane, and I feel something settle in my chest that I don't have a tidier word for than gratitude. Gratitude for a stranger who decided, at some real professional cost to herself, that fairness mattered more than following the path of least resistance. Gratitude for a father who insisted on both names, decades before either of us could have known why it would matter so much. Gratitude, even in some complicated way, for the 11 minutes I sat frozen in a cold car, because they taught me exactly how long I was still capable of waiting and exactly how much I no longer wanted to. I keep a copy of that first forged signature in a drawer in what used to be Richard's study, not out of bitterness, though I understand if that's what it sounds like, but as a kind of reminder. On the hard days, the days when old habits creep back in and I find myself softening a request before I've even finished thinking it, I take it out and I look at it, that careful, almost perfect copy of my own handwriting, and I remember what it cost me to let someone else write my name for 26 years without ever once asking whether I approved of what they were signing me up for. I don't think of myself as a victim in this story, and I hope if you've read this far, that you don't think of me that way either. I think of myself as a woman who was, for a very long time, extraordinarily patient. Patient in ways that were sometimes generous and sometimes simply exhausted. Patient in ways I mistook, for years, for love. And then, on one gray Tuesday morning, a stranger in a gray blazer looked at me across a bank lobby and gave me, without meaning to, permission to stop. I always smile now when I think about that lobby, the same smile I gave Richard 3 weeks before he understood what it meant. The smile of a woman who has just been handed the one thing she didn't know she was missing, the whole unvarnished truth, offered to her directly by her own name. Because I know something now that took me 26 years in one folder to learn, a woman who has spent her whole life balancing other people's numbers eventually learns to balance her own. And once she does, she never has to wait in anyone's car.